Good afternoon, dear colleagues, and welcome to hear our presentation of the conservation of Coptic parchment fragments and the bifolio in Finland. The presentation will cover the areas of the object history, conservation, and framing. We will also discuss about the provenance and ethical issues. The number of Coptic texts in Finland rose in the early 2010s when a private Finnish collector acquired over 200 pieces of Coptic items. This private collection was under research in an early Christian studies project in one of the main academic institutions in Finland between 2016 and 2020. The initial survey found that 13 parchment fragments within the collection are from a miniature codex containing the biblical Book of Esther. The text of Book of Esther was initially written in Hebrew and later translated into Greek. The 13 fragments are a Coptic version of a translation from the Greek version and therefore contain sections missing from the Hebrew original Book of Esther. The research group estimated that the codex was produced around 600 CE, based on a similar Coptic codex in Dublin that is securely dated to this time period. The exact place of production in Egypt has not yet been established.
We paper conservators, Anna and Marleena, were contacted by the research team to conserve the 13 parchment fragments from the Book of Esther and a bifolio that had not yet been under examination. The overall poor condition of the objects limited further research and caused a high risk of serious and progressive mechanical damage to them if handled. The work was carried out in steps over a total period of 6 months. The severely damaged parchment fragments of varying shapes and sizes were heavily deformed. They were not lying flat, but had gained a three-dimensional form due to distortion. The parchment was twisted, creased, shrunk, pleated, and torn. Additionally, most had lazy outlines and losses, as well as accumulated dirt and paper residue on the surface. The bifolio, like the fragments, had very low hydration content and had lost its strength and flexibility and was therefore sensitive for handling. In addition, when in another location, the bifolio broke into 2 leaves along the folding line. The bifolio had dark areas and was covered by heavy and a fixed layer of dark accretion that seemed like a mixture of mud, soil, soot, and sand. It also had heavy undulation, decay in the form of lacuna, and missing areas around the edges. Oxidation of the writing medium, iron-gall ink, had caused corrosion damage to the parchment in some areas.
The aim of the conservation projects was to stabilize the condition of the Coptic fragments and the bifolio and to minimize the risk of further physical damage with aspect to ensure the long-term preservation. Also, the aim was to enhance the visibility of the text and to secure objects' safe handling during research and a possible display in the future exhibition. The objective was to remove the dirt from the surface to increase the elasticity of the parchment by the means of humidification and to stabilize the corroded and fragile areas by using a suitable binder for the unstable Fe2 and 3 ions, by mending and supporting the weak areas. The aim of safe handling and display was directed through solving the challenge with the framing method. There's always a certain battle with the money paid and time consumed when working as a private conservator. The workflow had to be designed effective yet ultimately safe for the objects. We were lucky to receive eight parchment fragments to work on that were unimportant to the researchers, but would be kept as part of the collection. The designed conservation methods were test run to this small secondary material to establish a fluent workflow and to point out the possible risks of the procedures.
The conservation studio is not equipped with the latest technology, nor does it have controlled air conditioning. In the summer when the work took place, Helsinki was facing an unusual heat wave. This aspect of the conditions was impossible to control. We needed a humidification method to straighten the parchment that would keep the relative humidity controlled and consistent regardless of the weather conditions, either inside or outside the studio. Furthermore, we wished to have the possibility to work together in the same space without interruptions. Building small humidity chambers and working outside them did not seem like a satisfactory solution. We considered building a booth of some kind out of timber and plastic. A weekend spent relaxing in the garden led to a vision of a greenhouse. We bought a small lightweight greenhouse equipped with plastic walls and a zipper door and set it up in our workspace. It had just enough room for a small table for 2 persons to work inside it at the same time. The moisture was applied using an aerosol generator. The problem with flattening the parchment was yet to be resolved. For the supporting repairs, we only considered gold-beater skin, as it is a collagen material traditionally used for parchment repairs and provides a see-through filling. It also worked well for hinging the fragments onto inlay paper. The rule like with like was implemented and tests were performed to find a suitable adhesive. The mix of 5% isinglass and 6% gelatin gave the best test results, but there is a certain risk of gelatin going hard and yellowy when aged. We decided to use 5% isinglass. Isinglass formed a solid adhesion between parchment and gold-beater skin without straining the parchment. For housing, the client requested a double-sided glass frame sealed with cloth tape. We deliberated how to address the problem with the framing and double-sided visibility without squeezing the fragments between 2 pieces of glass. This obstacle was resolved by attaching each fragment onto an inlay paper that had a window matting made on both sides before fitting it between 2 pieces of 2 glasses. We would like to thank the magnificent Chester Beatty Library Conservation blog, where we got the idea to use the inlay method in the case of parchment fragments.
Loose dirt was removed before humidification with a soft brush. The humidification process started with increasing gradually to relative humidity in the greenhouse from about 50% first to 70%, and then to the point the fragments and bifolio relaxed, which was maximum 90%. The objects reached the level of relaxation, making straightening possible after around 3 to 4 hours of humidification. The fragments were gently and step by step helped to straighten using thin strips of Holitex polyester that were fastened with tape to the heavy support paper. The cleaning was continued simultaneously to the relaxed piece of parchment. Latex sponge, cotton wool, and broomstick were found too risky. Paper residue was removed using a scalpel. A sample of absorbing putty was submitted for limited scale analysis, and the material was determined as polymer mass containing alcohol without any oils. For the more stubborn dirt, upstream putty worked efficiently, especially in the high humidity levels, leaving no marks nor residue on the surface. The most challenging part of the project was to carry out conservation to the bifolio due to its fragile state and heavy surface dirt. The cleaning procedures performed on the smaller fragments were repeated on the bifolio. The firmly attached particles of dirt were again able to be removed with upstream once the object was relaxed. The best results were seen using upstream putty, but the parchment remained very darkened in places, and some of the text remained invisible. We also tried lapanite in poultice and water with isopropanol. Surface cleaning was stopped at certain point with the concern we would overclean the parchment and end up damaging the text. We decided to trust that the text would be interpreted using technical imaging methods.
There was a large area where the iron-gall ink suffered from corrosion that had progressed to dissolving some of the letters. Even though the parchment was now stored under stable conditions, the corrosion damage could be expected to progress since the material was already in poor condition. Because adding moisture to the parchment locally using a brush had proved problematic, the gelatin treatment was performed by applying 1% gelatin in aerosol form using an aerosol generator. The bifolio was sprayed twice on both sides, spending about 2 minutes on each side. For mounting, the outlines of the fragments were traced onto the inlay paper 2 mm wider than the original and cut out. Small hinges made of gold beater skin were inserted around the parchment using isinglass. Next, the fragments were placed on the inlay and hinges were attached to the paper. The weak and torn areas were simultaneously supported and repaired by bridging. The pair of window mats having the inlay in between were joined together. The fragments were left to acclimate for 2 months. They did not show any damage or changes in their physical appearance, and the hinges were intact. There was
With the bifolio, the work proceeded the same way as with the fragments, with one difference. As the framed bifolio was to be stored under fluctuating Finnish weather conditions throughout the year, this threat was addressed by placing 2 narrow L-shaped strips of arsol on both window mats to keep the humidity level close to 50%. There has been a debate in the conservation field about the lithium chloride salts in arsol possibly affecting the iron-gall ink, but after consulting a chemist who assessed the risk as minimal in this case, the method was applied. When the conservation was completed, we received information we were not prepared for. The private collection on which the parchment fragments and the bifolio were part of had a very unclear, if not outright unquestionable provenience. Even though we are professionals with extensive experience in the cultural heritage field, it was clear that we both lacked prior experience of the issues related to illicit international trafficking of cultural objects and how it reflects in our work in Finland. Our contractor was a notable academic institution whose research project commissioned us to provide the service as private conservators. The task given was to make it possible to both research and display the fragments. We knew that the objects were part of a private collection we were unfamiliar with, but were assured there was no conflict with the object's history. This turn of events raised a number of questions. Did the conservation work make us a part of a sequence of criminal activity? Had we unwittingly participated in whitewashing cultural objects? Had we neglected our code of ethics by working on an object whose provenience turned out to be unclear? How extensively is the conservator required to investigate the provenience of objects? Which comes first, refusal to work or preserving cultural heritage if the object is in critical condition but had been imported illegally? And would cultural heritage objects be restored by non-professionals if conservators refuse to touch these kinds of objects?
Increasing attention has been paid to risks faced by world cultural heritage, especially over the past decade. Legislation and agreements have been used to try and hinder the illicit trafficking and theft of cultural goods. In this, international cultural heritage organizations play a significant role both in defining the ethical codes and policies. Back to our case. We consulted a lawyer to find out whether our actions had caused us to participate in illegal criminal activity that violated the UNESCO or UNITROIT conventions or broke the law. While this was not the case, another topic to consider was the partially contradictory guidelines presented in ethical codes for conservators. The fundamental role of a conservator is the preservation of cultural heritage, and the guidelines demand that we use any possible means to establish the background of an object or collection before the work is undertaken. But on the other hand, they give us the right to trust the information provided by the contractor or owner.
Interestingly enough, meanwhile, the conservation was ongoing. Collaborative project called WCOM was established in Finland. It focuses on Finland's position in terms of the global situation of illicit trafficking of cultural heritage objects. There is no widespread market for antiquities in Finland, and archaeological objects with religious connotations are approached with only a highly limited level of intensity. As accomplished as the project of the WCOM has been, so far the discussion has only focused on research and the role of researchers. Conservators have not been included in the debate. We also contacted the officer in charge of export of cultural goods at the Finnish Heritage Agency. The case we are involved in has drawn attention nationally, and discussion of the matter has become topical. One central issue has been the lack of applicable legislation in terms of stopping the import of questionable material. European Union regulation ratified in Finland last December forbids the import of cultural goods taken from third countries via illicit trade. However, the regulation is not applied retroactively. Legislation to be supplemented in 2025 will provide tools for official authorities to solve the situation. Meanwhile, discussion regarding the role, responsibilities, and duties of the conservator in Finland is yet waiting to happen.
And then to the conclusions. Each parchment has its own individual characteristics, and it is difficult, maybe even impossible, to predict how it will behave. Large fragments with extensive damage are especially challenging. We found that all the fragments were fragile and brittle when dry, but once humidified, they appeared stable and robust. Relaxation provided us with the opportunity to clean the parchment. The working conditions made possible by the greenhouse were excellent for conservation. Changes in climate conditions and their effects on parchment in non-museal storage facilities were one of our research problems. The conserved objects were examined 2 years after the conservation procedures. There were no changes detected in the condition of the cased parchment fragments, and the attachment still appeared stable and impeccable. Within this time frame, we consider the conservation procedures a success. We also want to address the problems caused by illicit trafficking and illegal import. The phenomenon is very complex, and solving it requires open and ongoing discussion among all professional groups working with archaeological material and cultural goods, including conservators. What we need in the discussion above all else is openness and courage. In addition to that, concrete information is needed about how to apply both existing legislation and ethical statements into our practical work, because at present they remain somewhat theoretical. We would like to thank all the people who helped us during the project and its aftermath, as well as the Armagnaean Institute for organizing this seminar and the organizers for inviting us. And of course, thank you, our audience, for listening.